So continuing our discussion of analyzing class status, it brings us to another way of looking at the job market today. And that's looking at, in very general terms, that is, when you discuss the types of jobs there. And this brings us to a distinction between primary versus secondary job markets or labor markets. Now, the first, primary, refers to those jobs characterized by, stability, they're stable positions with good salaries, wages. They typically include good benefits in terms of health care, pensions, so forth, paid holidays. And also typically they require higher education, or at least experience is necessary. So obviously we're talking about professionals or just even, like skilled labor included in there, for example, in the healthcare industry. And as opposed to primary jobs or the primary job market, you also have the secondary job market. And here, these are the unstable jobs with poor pay, with, for the most part, no benefits or little benefits. You may have health care, but it's a poor health care plan, right? And many of the so-called dead-end jobs that you may see today, like our service economy, right? These are usually found within the secondary, or they're classified as part of the secondary job market. So you're thinking about laborers. Also, when it comes to a lot of immigrant groups, you're thinking of businesses within the ethnic enclave, like ethnic restaurants or groceries or, ethnic stores that cater to co-ethnics, right? Now, what we're going to do is kind of square these labor markets, both the open and segmented, and also the primary versus secondary. We're going to try to square it with more contemporary immigration when it comes to Asian Americans. Now, there below on the slide, it says the types of occupations commonly held by Asian Americans. Well, certainly there's professionals, as we noted. We just discussed the 1965 Act, how that attracted professionals. And we also talked about laborers, like those the secondary market, and also small business owners. So those are the three niches, economic niches that tend to be occupied by Asian Americans. By the way, that's not the only three niches in the service economy. Certainly there's others, but let's remember we're talking mostly about Asian American immigration here. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the types of jobs in the labor market that apply to Asian Americans in their contemporary lives. And what we'll do here with the next discussion is first look at professionals, and then we'll move on to laborers, and then finally to entrepreneurs, usually found in what's called ethnic economies. Okay, first looking at professionals here on this slide. Obviously, as we just discussed, this intersects with the primary labor market. And here, again, we see impressive Asian American overrepresentation in this category. And therefore, we have to ask, is the reason for this overrepresentation, is this due to what? Structural causes? Is it due to cultural? Perhaps a combination of both? So I have to say that when it comes to scholars, as I did mention in past lectures, scholars in the field of social research, social sciences, tend to emphasize structural backgrounds. They foreground these when it comes to social consequences and outcomes. So certainly here, by researchers, you see structural backgrounds. I'm not saying they ignore culture, and we'll just discuss that in a sec, but again, structural backgrounds tend to be foregrounded by these researchers when they study Asian immigration. And here's a structural background right away. And we know this, that since 1965, professionals are prioritized by the U.S. state itself, by the institution of the U.S. state. Okay, so when I discuss this, we're talking about the U.S. state itself, the government. We're also talking about the law, right? That in the immigration laws prioritize professionals. So obviously that's a structural background. Okay, it's not just, Asian culture and hard work and discipline is why you see overrepresentation. Sure, that figures into it, but when we really think about, the fact that they're prioritized by the U.S. state again with the 1965 Act, and also another thing we'll discuss soon. Let's discuss it right now. The 1990 Immigration Act. Okay, these laws are basically going to lead to composition of professionals in the United States from Asia. You'll see a high representation of them, and then it's going to be usually the case that they will encourage their own children to become professionals and therefore to do well in school, right? Okay, now I just mentioned the 1990 Immigration Act. One part of this is mentioned here. Okay, immigration laws. Again, we're talking about structural factors. Immigration laws being one. And besides the 1965 Act, we have, again, the 1990 Immigration Act, which put into operation H-1B visas. These are work visas. Okay. Again, they're temporary. Okay. H-1B work visas are temporary work visas allowing American employers to hire foreign labor from abroad into these specialty jobs. And when I say specialty jobs, I'm referring to healthcare, technology, science, jobs like engineering and so forth. Now, here's the thing. I just mentioned it's temporary work, right? It's comprised of foreign workers, not American workers, obviously. And therefore, employers pay H-1B workers less. That's why the law is there in the first place. So they could attract foreign workers here, but they could also save, again, on their labor costs. Now, typically, the case is that these foreign workers that come to work here on an H-1B work visa, they make more in the United States than doing the same exact work in their home country. So let's say an engineer makes more by becoming an H-1B worker in the United States than he or she does in, let's say, the home country of India. Okay? So that's the H-1B visa. So certainly when you think about Asian America today, you see this increase in the amount of what's called the professional managerial class. And that's, again, materialized through the H-1B work visa. Now, this is great, it seems at the outset, but there are some issues related to H-1B workers. And here are some of the unique circumstances. When you take a harder look at H-1B visa workers, again, I just mentioned this, they tend to be underpaid compared to the American workers. So some argue it's a form of structural exploitation right off the bat. Now, again, that's usually offset by the fact that, hey, they're getting paid more here than in their home country, but still, some argue it's still a form of systemic exploitation. Moreover, H-1B workers tend to be segregated to particular positions, and this is based on their contract that they sign. And once they enter these particular positions within that, let's say, business or corporation, there's little migration or upward mobility, little chances for promoting to other areas, other positions, other departments in that corporation. Okay, so it's not exactly an open labor market for them, to use our term. Now, another vicissitude that they tend to experience is that during times of economic downturns, especially, should a corporation decide to cut labor, they're the first to be laid off usually because they're the temporary workers, they're the foreign workers. So you see them being laid off during economic hardships. Another thing is that H-1B workers are non-unionized. There's no unions to represent their interest on the job. Therefore, if you're an H-1B worker, you can't really protest or complain about possible exploitative conditions should you experience any. Okay. So, and they typically can't get different jobs elsewhere. They're relegated to that job that they signed up for. So, in a way, it's quite restrictive. So if you compare that to the native worker, the American worker that is, then they have a lot more restrictions on them compared to the American native worker. Yet at the same time, the trade-off is that they make more money in the United States than they do in their home country. Now, incidentally, this whole issue of income discrepancy as related to H-1B workers I just described applies to other Asian American professionals, even if they're not part of the H-1B worker visa program. In other words, even for these workers, not part of the H-1B workers, they're immigrants. They come here as professionals, and they tend to be given, or they tend to accept even, lower wages. Oftentimes, the universities of their home country, their credentials, in other words, well, it's not recognized in the United States. Not all the time, but oftentimes it's not. For example, a doctor from the Philippines, his degree will not be applicable to the United States. Okay, and other jobs apply as well. So often they accept lower, not only a downgraded status in terms of jobs, right, being a nurse instead of a doctor, but often they accept lower wages. In fact, some end up, at least initially when they arrive here, even if they have advanced degrees, they end up in the secondary labor market, and they have to try to move up to another position, right? By the way, scholars do note that much less income discrepancy is occurring between native-born Asian Americans and whites. Okay, so this happens to be applicable to more immigrants. Okay, another issue for Asian American professionals, again, talking about professional class, is ethnic variability. Now, ethnic variability found within Asian American ethnicities. Obviously, we've been discussing this for a while. So, for example, with Filipinos, they tend to show more income parity, that is to say, equality with white workers. Now, Vietnamese and Cambodians, you see much less income parity or income equality when it comes to them and white workers in the United States. Okay, so you have to look at the different groups, the subgroups under the rubric of Asian America, and see if there's such a thing as the model minority there. And oftentimes there's not. And also another thing is the issue of a glass ceiling among Asian American professionals. Okay, what's a glass ceiling? That refers to a term that denotes the barriers faced by some people. And by the way, especially to women, and especially women in the past, they used to face what's called a glass ceiling, preventing them from achieving upward movement in their jobs due to their gender, in this case, right? And it's called a glass ceiling because it refers to that unwritten part of their jobs. In other words, it's not part of their policies prohibiting women, or in this case, Asian Americans, but it's unwritten. It's sort of acknowledged among those in that business that, hey, we don't allow this type of people to move up, or we allow much less number of them to move up.